Jean-Baptiste du Casse was born on August 2, 1646, in Saubus, a small town near Dax in southwestern France. His family were Huguenots, French Protestants in a country where Catholicism was the state religion. This would matter greatly for his early career prospects. His father, according to most accounts, was Bertrand du Casse, though some records suggest he was actually born in Pau to Jacques du Casse and Judith Remy. The uncertainty around his birth reflects the fluid nature of record-keeping in provincial France in the mid-17th century. What is certain is that du Casse came from a family with commercial connections. Growing up in southwestern France, near the Atlantic coast and the Spanish border, he would have been aware from childhood of the maritime trade that connected Europe to the wider world. The 17th century was the age of expanding European empires, and France was competing vigorously with Spain, England, and the Netherlands for control of lucrative colonial territories and trade routes. As a young man, du Casse enlisted in the French merchant marine. This was a natural path for someone from his background. Maritime commerce offered opportunities for advancement that might not be available on land, particularly for a Huguenot in Catholic France. He served in the French East India Company, gaining experience in long-distance trade and navigation. Then, probably in the 1670s, du Casse joined the Compagnie du Sénégal. This company had been established in 1673 to take over French trading operations on the West African coast after the collapse of the French West India Company. The Compagnie du Sénégal had one primary business, the slave trade. In 1677, du Casse was appointed director of the Compagnie du Sénégal and governor of the west coast of Africa. This was an extraordinary promotion for a man still in his early 30s. It placed him at the center of the French slave trading operation. In May 1678, commanding a ship called the Entendu with 44 guns, he took possession of Gorée, an island off the coast of modern-day Senegal that would become one of the most important slave trading centers in the Atlantic world. Gorée was strategically located for the slave trade. Ships could anchor safely in its harbor, while agents went inland to purchase enslaved people from African traders. The island had fortifications to protect against rival European powers and facilities for holding captives before they were loaded onto ships. Du Casse's capture of Gorée for France gave the Compagnie du Sénégal a crucial operational base. The same year, 1678, du Casse captured the Dutch fort of Arguin, further north along the African coast in modern-day Mauritania. This was another blow to Dutch commercial interests and another victory for French control of the slave trade in the region. Du Casse was proving himself an effective military commander as well as a commercial administrator. For his services to the Compagnie du Sénégal, the company authorized du Casse to arm several vessels for the slave trade on his own account. This meant he could operate as a slave trader personally, not just as an administrator for the company. He took full advantage of this authorization. Over the next several years, du Casse commanded ships that sailed from West Africa to the Caribbean, carrying enslaved Africans across the Atlantic in the hellish conditions of the Middle Passage. The mechanics of this trade were well established by the 1670s. European ships arrived on the African coast loaded with trade goods, textiles, metal bars, gunpowder, alcohol, and manufactured items. These goods were traded to African merchants and rulers who brought captives to the coast. The captives came from various sources: prisoners of war, people kidnapped by raiding parties, individuals sold into slavery by their own communities for debt or as punishment, and people who were already enslaved within African societies. Once purchased, Enslaved people were held in fortifications like Gorée until a ship had assembled a full cargo. Then they were loaded into the ship's hold, packed tightly to maximize the number that could be transported. The Atlantic crossing, known as the Middle Passage, typically lasted 6 to 8 weeks depending on weather and currents. Mortality rates varied, but were typically between 10 and 20%, sometimes much higher when disease swept through a ship. Du Casse commanded these voyages. He was responsible for the purchase of human beings, for their confinement during the Atlantic crossing, for managing the crew who guarded them, for minimizing mortality so as to maximize profit. Every aspect of his business required him to view human beings as cargo, as commodities to be bought and sold, and he was good at it. The company authorized him to arm multiple vessels because he delivered profits. When ships reached the Caribbean, typically islands like Martinique, Guadeloupe, or the French portion of Hispaniola called Saint-Domingue, enslaved Africans were sold at auction to plantation owners. The ships then loaded sugar, rum, coffee, indigo, and other plantation products for the return voyage to France. This triangular trade manufactured goods from Europe to Africa, enslaved people from Africa to the Americas, plantation products from the Americas to Europe, was the engine of French colonial prosperity in the 17th century. Du Casse became one of the richest planters in Martinique, with the wealth he accumulated from the slave trade. But he had ambitions beyond commerce. With his slave trading profits, Du Casse purchased a ship in Saint-Domingue and began a career as a privateer. Privateering was state-sanctioned piracy. European nations at war with each other issued letters of marque, licenses that authorized private ship owners to attack and plunder enemy vessels. The arrangement was simple. Privateers kept a large share of whatever they captured, and the sponsoring nation received a portion of the profits along with the strategic benefit of having enemy commerce disrupted. For someone like Du Casse, privateering offered a path to even greater wealth and, potentially, social advancement. Du Casse proved as successful at privateering as he had been at slave trading. He captured valuable prizes from Dutch and English ships. Then, in a calculated move that demonstrated his political savvy, he sailed to France and offered half of his loot directly to King Louis XIV. This was brilliant strategy. By personally presenting his plunder to the king, Du Casse demonstrated his loyalty, his success, and his willingness to enrich the royal treasury. Louis XIV was impressed. In return for his gift to the crown, Du Casse was appointed lieutenant in the French Navy in 1686. This was an extraordinary leap in status. Du Casse had been born to a Huguenot family, Protestants who faced legal discrimination in Catholic France. He had worked in commerce, a respectable but not noble profession. Now, through his success in the slave trade and privateering, he had gained a commission in the Royal Navy. He had, in essence, bought his way into the military nobility. The timing of Du Casse's appointment was significant. In 1685, Louis XIV had revoked the Edict of Nantes, which had granted limited religious toleration to French Protestants. The revocation made Protestantism illegal in France and forced Huguenots to either convert to Catholicism, flee the country, or face persecution. Du Casse chose conversion. In 1685, he renounced his Calvinist faith and converted to Catholicism. This conversion was almost certainly opportunistic rather than sincere. It was the price of maintaining his position and advancing his career under Louis XIII's increasingly absolutist and intolerant regime. Du Casse even admitted his family's Huguenot background in a letter to Naval Minister Pontchartrain in 1691, acknowledging what many at court already knew or suspected. But his conversion, his wealth, and his useful skills allowed him to overcome the stigma of his religious origins. The French monarchy under Louis XIV was willing to overlook a great deal in exchange for competence, loyalty, and, above all, the ability to generate revenue. The same year, on March 16, 1686, du Casse married Marthe Baudrat in Dieppe. The marriage connected him to a family deeply involved in finance and colonial commerce. Marthe came with connections to the banking world and the networks of merchants who financed colonial enterprises. The marriage strengthened du Casse's position in the overlapping worlds of commerce, colonial administration, and royal favor. In 1687, du Casse led an expedition against El Maina, a major slave-trading fort on the Gold Coast of West Africa, controlled at the time by the Dutch. The expedition failed. Dutch defenses were too strong, and du Casse was forced to withdraw. But the attempt demonstrated his continued involvement in the politics and violence of the West African slave trade even after he had officially joined the French Navy. In June 1689, during the 9 Years' War between France and a coalition including England, the Netherlands, and Spain, du Casse led another expedition, this time against Dutch colonial possessions in South America. He attacked Berbice and Fort Zeelandia in Suriname. These attacks were part of France's broader strategy of disrupting rival colonial powers. Du Casse was proving himself a valuable military commander in the Caribbean theater. On November 1, 1689, du Casse was promoted to captain of a frigate. Shortly after, he recaptured the islands of Saint Martin and Saint Barthélemy from the English, restoring them to French control. His military successes were accumulating, and he was earning a reputation as an effective commander in Caribbean warfare. Then, in 1691, Louis XIV appointed Jean-Baptiste du Casse as governor of Saint-Domingue. This was one of the most important colonial appointments in the French Empire. Saint-Domingue occupied the western third of the island of Hispaniola. The Spanish controlled the eastern portion, which would eventually become the Dominican Republic. The French portion would eventually become Haiti, but in 1691 it was a rapidly growing slave colony that would soon become the most profitable colonial possession in the world. Saint-Domingue in 1691 was still relatively undeveloped compared to what it would become. The population included French plantation owners, small farmers, merchants, a growing number of free people of color, many of whom were themselves slave owners, and an enslaved population that was beginning to outnumber the free population. The colony also had a significant population of buccaneers, pirates and privateers who operated from bases along the coast and raided Spanish shipping. Du Casse's appointment as governor was significant because of his background. He understood the slave trade intimately. He had directed it from the African side, commanded slave ships across the Atlantic, and profited personally from the sale of enslaved people in Caribbean markets. He understood privateering and could work effectively with the buccaneers who were crucial to French naval power in the Caribbean. And he had proven himself a capable military commander. As governor, du Casse immediately gained the respect of the buccaneers of Saint-Domingue. This was no small achievement. Buccaneers were notoriously difficult to control. They were independent-minded, violent, and suspicious of authority. But du Casse spoke their language. He had been a privateer himself. He understood their motivations and could offer them opportunities for profit through officially sanctioned raids on enemy colonies. In the months following his appointment, du Casse organized expeditions to plunder English colonies in the vicinity. His most notable target was Port Royal in Jamaica, which had just been struck by a devastating earthquake in June 1692. The earthquake had destroyed much of the town and killed thousands of people. Du Casse saw an opportunity. While Port Royal was still reeling from the disaster, he led a raid that captured significant plunder from the weakened English settlement. This was calculated brutality, attacking a population already devastated by natural disaster, but it was effective from a military and economic perspective. Du Casse's governorship of Saint-Domingue coincided with a crucial period in the colony's development. During the 1690s, Saint-Domingue was rapidly expanding its sugar production. Sugar plantations required massive capital investment, clearing land, building processing facilities, and, most importantly, purchasing large numbers of enslaved workers. The death rate among enslaved people on sugar plantations was horrific, often 6 to 10% annually. This meant that plantation owners needed to constantly purchase new enslaved workers to maintain and expand production. As governor, Du Casse oversaw this expansion. He facilitated the slave trade, ensuring that ships could land their human cargoes efficiently. He maintained the legal and military systems that kept enslaved people in bondage. He worked with plantation owners to develop the infrastructure the colony needed. Under his governance, the foundations were laid for Saint-Domingue to become the wealthiest colony in the Caribbean, producing more sugar than all the British Caribbean colonies combined. The system Du Casse administered was one of calculated brutality. French colonial law, particularly the Code Noir promulgated by Louis XIV in 1685, theoretically regulated the treatment of enslaved people. It specified minimum standards for food and clothing, prohibited torture, and established procedures for manumission. But in practice, these regulations were rarely enforced. Plantation owners had almost absolute power over the people they enslaved, and colonial administrators like Du Casse prioritized economic production over humanitarian concerns. The result was a society of extraordinary cruelty. Enslaved people worked from dawn to dusk in the brutal heat of Caribbean sugar fields. They were subjected to whipping, branding, and other forms of violence as routine discipline. They were separated from their families at the whim of owners. They were denied education, legal rights, and any path to freedom except through the unlikely benevolence of their masters. And they died at rates that required constant replenishment from the African slave trade. Du Casse knew all of this intimately. As a former slave ship captain and plantation owner, he understood exactly how the system functioned. As governor, he made policy decisions that reinforced and expanded this system. When plantation owners complained about insufficient supplies of enslaved workers, Du Casse worked to ensure more slave ships arrived from Africa. When enslaved people escaped to the mountains to form maroon communities, Du Casse organized military expeditions to hunt them down and return them to bondage. When buccaneers captured slaves from enemy colonies, Du Casse facilitated their sale in Saint-Domingue markets. In 1694, Du Casse's forces were defeated at Carlisle Bay in Barbados. It was one of his few military failures, and he withdrew to Saint-Domingue to regroup. But his reputation remained strong, and in 1697 he would participate in what became one of the most profitable raids of the entire era of Caribbean privateering. In May 1697, Baron de Pointis, a French naval commander, led a major expedition against Cartagena de Indias, the richest Spanish city in South America. Cartagena was where treasure ships gathered before sailing to Spain loaded with gold, silver, and jewels from mines in Peru and Mexico. It was one of the most heavily fortified cities in the Americas, surrounded by stone walls and protected by several fortresses. Pointis commanded a fleet of 7 capital ships, 3 frigates, and smaller vessels that had sailed from Brest, France, in January 1697. When the fleet arrived at Saint-Domingue in March, Pointis requested assistance from Governor du Casse. Du Casse was initially reluctant. He had preferred an attack on Portobello, which he considered a more strategic target, but he agreed to join the expedition. He brought his own squadron of ships and recruited approximately 650 buccaneers from Saint-Domingue to supplement Pointis' 1,200 regular soldiers. The expedition also included colonial volunteers and approximately 180 free black soldiers from Saint-Domingue. The presence of these black soldiers in a French military expedition is notable and reveals one of the complex contradictions of Caribbean colonial society. Some free people of color in Saint-Domingue had achieved considerable wealth and status, often as plantation owners themselves. They served in the colonial militia and participated in military expeditions like the Cartagena raid. Their participation in the colonial system did not liberate them from racism, but it did give them a stake in maintaining the society that oppressed the majority of black people in the colony. Before departing, Pointis and Du Casse made a written agreement with the buccaneers. The buccaneers had learned from bitter experience that naval commanders sometimes cheated them out of their promised share of plunder. The agreement specified that loot would be divided fairly, with the buccaneers receiving 1/5 of the total value of everything captured. The agreement was signed on March 22, 1697, aboard Pointis's flagship, and then renewed at the church in Petite Goave, the buccaneer base on the western coast of Saint-Domingue. The combined fleet of approximately 30 ships and over 6,000 men appeared before Cartagena in April 1697. The Spanish defenses, once formidable, had deteriorated over the years. The fortresses that protected the city fell relatively easily to the French assault. The attackers lost, only about 60 men in the actual fighting. Between May 6th and May 24th, 1697, the French systematically plundered Cartagena. They occupied the city and methodically extracted wealth from every available source. They looted churches, private homes, government buildings, and warehouses. They seized gold, silver, jewels, and valuable merchandise. They extorted ransoms from wealthy residents who wanted to escape. The Spanish governor, Don Diego de los Rios, was allowed to flee to Mompox with some important people and a portion of his wealth, probably in exchange for a substantial bribe. They took everything of value they could find. The total value of the plunder was estimated at between 10 and 20 million livres, a staggering sum. To put this in perspective, the annual revenue of the French government at this time was approximately 200 million livres. The Cartagena raid captured somewhere between 5 and 10% of France's annual revenue in a single operation. But then, Pointis betrayed the buccaneers. Instead of dividing the loot according to the written agreement, he sailed directly for France with the bulk of the treasure, leaving Du Casse and the buccaneers behind with only a token payment. According to the agreement, the buccaneers should have received approximately 2 million livres. Instead, they received only nominal compensation. The buccaneers, who had done much of the heavy fighting and had taken significant casualties, were furious. Du Casse and the outraged buccaneers returned to Cartagena. Without the discipline of Pointis's regular soldiers to restrain them, they conducted a second, even more brutal sack of the city. Contemporary accounts describe an orgy of violence: rape, torture, extortion, and murder. The buccaneers extracted every bit of wealth they could find, showing no mercy to the Spanish population that had already been plundered once. This second sack of Cartagena revealed the nature of the violence that underpinned colonial wealth. When the veneer of military discipline was removed, what remained was naked brutality and greed. The buccaneers du Casse had recruited were not soldiers following rules of war. They were violent criminals who saw the Spanish colonists as sources of wealth to be exploited by any means necessary. The return voyage from Cartagena was disastrous for many of the French forces. Yellow fever swept through the ships, killing hundreds of men who had survived the fighting. The disease was particularly devastating to the regular soldiers who had come directly from France and had no immunity to tropical diseases. The buccaneers and colonial volunteers, who had lived in the Caribbean for years, fared somewhat better, but even they suffered significant casualties. Some of the buccaneers never returned to Saint-Domingue. Several ships ran aground near Cartagena and were captured by the Spanish. 4 other buccaneer vessels were captured by the English and taken to Jamaica. A few buccaneers decided to head toward the Darien region of Panama, where a Scottish colonial expedition had recently established a settlement called New Edinburgh as part of the ill-fated Darien scheme. Du Casse had actually proposed to Louis XIV that France establish a colony in Darien, arguing that French buccaneers had good relations with the indigenous Kuna people of the region. But the French naval minister discouraged the idea, concerned that such a move would provoke Spanish retaliation against the newly established French colony of Louisiana. Du Casse himself then sailed to France to claim his share of the plunder directly from King Louis XIV. The dispute over the division of the Cartagena treasure became a political issue at the French court. Eventually, Du Casse and his men received compensation of 1.4 million francs. While this was far less than the promised 1/5 share, it was still an enormous sum. Du Casse personally became even wealthier from this single expedition. For his services, Louis XIV promoted Du Casse to admiral and made him a knight in the Order of St. Louis, one of the highest honors the king could bestow. The slave trader and privateer had reached the pinnacle of French naval hierarchy. His daughter, Marthe du Casse, would marry Louis de la Rochefoucauld, Marquis de Roy, one of the most prestigious noble families in France. Her dowry was 200,000 livres, an incredible sum that demonstrated just how wealthy Du Casse had become through the slave trade, privateering, and colonial plunder. Du Casse remained governor of Saint-Domingue until 1700, though some sources indicate he continued in various official capacities until 1703. During his tenure, he oversaw the explosive growth of the colony's plantation economy. The enslaved population grew rapidly as ships continued to arrive from Africa with new captives. In 1681, there had been only about 2,000 enslaved people in Saint-Domingue. By 1700, when Du Casse left office, there were tens of thousands. By 1789, on the eve of the Haitian Revolution, the enslaved population would reach approximately $500,000, outnumbering free whites by a ratio of more than 10 to 1. More land was cleared for sugar plantations. The infrastructure of roads, ports, and processing facilities expanded. Saint-Domingue was becoming the economic jewel of the French colonial empire. The wealth flowing from Saint-Domingue to France was staggering. By the time of the French Revolution in 1789, almost 1 million people in France, out of a total population of about 25 million, depended directly or indirectly on Saint-Domingue's trade for their livelihoods. The colony produced more wealth than any other European colonial possession in the Americas. And this wealth was built entirely on slavery, on the labor of hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans working under conditions of systematic brutality. Ducasse left Saint-Domingue wealthier and more powerful than when he had arrived. But the system he had helped build and expand would eventually destroy itself. The contradictions inherent in a society built on slavery, where a tiny minority of white plantation owners controlled hundreds of thousands of enslaved people through violence and terror, would become unsustainable. After leaving Saint-Domingue, Ducasse continued his naval career during the War of the Spanish Succession. In 1702, he achieved one of his most notable military victories, defeating the English admiral John Benbow near Santa Marta in what is known as the Action of August 1702. Benbow, one of England's most respected naval commanders, was wounded in the battle and died shortly after. Ducasse's victory was celebrated in France and further enhanced his reputation. In 1704, Ducasse participated in the Battle of Malaga, one of the largest naval battles of the War of the Spanish Succession. The battle involved over 150 ships and was fought between a combined French-Spanish fleet and an English-Dutch fleet. While the battle was tactically inconclusive, the Franco-Spanish fleet held the field, and Ducasse distinguished himself in the fighting. He also participated in the Siege of Barcelona in 1705 and other major military engagements during the war. For his service to Spain's new Bourbon king, Philip V, Ducasse was made a Knight of the Order of the Golden Fleece, one of the most prestigious chivalric orders in Europe. This was an extraordinary honor for someone who had started his career as a merchant sailor and slave trader. Jean-Baptiste du Casse ended his career as a lieutenant general of the French Navy and a commander of the Royal and Military Order of St. Louis. He had accumulated wealth, titles, honors, and connections at the highest levels of French society. He had married into banking families, and his daughter had married into the high nobility. He had transformed himself from a Huguenot outsider into a pillar of the French establishment. Ducasse died on June 25, 1715, in Bourbon-l'Archambault, a spa town in central France where wealthy people went to take the healing waters. He was 68 years old. He died wealthy, honored, and surrounded by the privileges his career had earned him. Jean-Baptiste du Casse built his fortune and his career on slavery. He was not a passive beneficiary of the system. He was an active architect of it. As director of the Compagnie du Sénégal, he controlled French slave trading operations on the West African coast. As a slave ship captain, he personally transported captive Africans across the Atlantic. As governor of Saint-Domingue, he oversaw the expansion of the plantation system that would make the colony the wealthiest in the Caribbean. His story reveals how the slave trade functioned as a path to wealth and social advancement in the French Atlantic world. Ducasse started as the son of a Huguenot family in provincial France, facing legal discrimination because of his religion. Through skill, ruthlessness, and strategic choices, he became an admiral, a knight, and a member of the French elite. At each step, his advancement was funded by profits from slavery. The wealth Ducasse accumulated came directly from human suffering on an almost unimaginable scale. During his years directing and participating in the slave trade, tens of thousands of Africans were purchased, transported, and sold into slavery in the Caribbean. The Middle Passage killed approximately 10 to 20% of captives. Thousands died in the holds of ships under conditions Ducasse knew intimately because he had commanded those ships. The enslaved people who survived the Atlantic crossing faced lives of brutal labor on sugar plantations. Saint-Domingue had mortality rates among enslaved people that were among the highest in the Americas. Plantation owners calculated that it was cheaper to work enslaved people to death and purchase replacements than to improve living conditions. This was the system Du Casse facilitated and expanded as governor. But Du Casse's story is also about how the slave trade was integrated into the mainstream of European society, not separate from it. Du Casse was not operating on the margins. He was acting with royal authorization and support. Louis XIV personally benefited from Du Casse's activities. The king received a share of slave trading profits, a share of privateering plunder, and the strategic benefits of having a loyal and capable administrator governing France's most valuable colony. The French nobility and commercial elite were deeply invested in the success of Saint-Domingue. They owned plantations, they financed trading voyages, they purchased colonial products, and they lived off the wealth the colony generated. Du Casse's daughter married a marquis with a dowry of over 1,000,000 livres, money that came directly from slavery. That marquise's family accepted the money without apparent moral qualm, because slavery was simply how wealth was generated in the colonial economy. This was the banality of evil on a systemic scale. Du Casse was not a monster in his personal relationships. He was a dutiful son, a husband, a father, a loyal servant of the king. He fulfilled his duties as governor, maintained order in the colony, and advanced French strategic interests. He was, by the standards of his time and his social class, a successful and admirable man. But those standards accepted as normal the systematic brutalization and commodification of human beings. They accepted that some people could be property. They accepted that profit justified almost any level of cruelty. They accepted that the wealth of a few could be built on the suffering of many. The system Du Casse helped build eventually collapsed in violence. In 1791, 91 years after Du Casse left his position as governor, the enslaved people of Saint-Domingue rose in revolt. What began as a series of plantation uprisings became a full-scale revolution that would eventually establish Haiti as an independent nation in 1804, the first nation founded by formerly enslaved people, the first black republic in the modern world. The Haitian Revolution was one of the bloodiest conflicts of its era. Tens of thousands died in fighting between enslaved rebels, free people of color, white colonists, and the French, Spanish, and British forces that all tried to control the island at various points. The plantation economy that had made Saint-Domingue so wealthy was destroyed. The white planter class was killed, expelled, or fled. The system of slavery that had generated such enormous profits for France was overthrown through force of arms. The Revolution's violence was a direct response to the violence of slavery itself. For over a century, enslaved people in Saint-Domingue had been subjected to systematic brutality. They had been whipped, tortured, worked to death, and treated as less than human. The plantation owners and colonial administrators who profited from this system had created the conditions for revolutionary violence through their own actions. Jean-Baptiste du Casse did not live to see the Haitian Revolution. He died in 1715, 76 years before the uprising began. But he was one of the architects of the system that made revolution inevitable. By expanding and systematizing slavery in Saint-Domingue, by integrating the colony into French economic and political structures, by making it so profitable that the French elite depended on it, he helped create an inherently unstable and unjust society. The revolution revealed something that Du Casse and his contemporaries had refused to acknowledge: that enslaved people were human beings with agency, intelligence, and the capacity to organize and fight for their freedom. The colonial system depended on the fiction that enslaved people were passive, incapable of resistance, naturally suited to bondage. The Haitian Revolution shattered that fiction completely. Enslaved people proved capable of military organization, strategic thinking, political negotiation, and ultimately of defeating the armies of the most powerful empires in Europe. The leaders of the Haitian Revolution, Toussaint Louverture, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Henri Christophe, were all men who had been enslaved in Saint-Domingue under the system Du Casse had administered. They had experienced firsthand the brutality of the plantation regime. They had seen their families torn apart, their bodies marked by whips, their labor stolen, their humanity denied. When they led the revolution, they were not fighting for abstract principles. They were fighting for concrete freedom from the system that had tormented them and everyone they knew. The French government, even after the revolution, refused to fully accept Haiti's independence. In 1825, France demanded that Haiti pay 150 million francs in compensation to former plantation owners for their lost property, including the enslaved people who had freed themselves. This sum was 10 times Haiti's annual budget. Haiti was forced to take out loans from French banks to make these payments, loans that would burden the country's economy for generations. France essentially extorted payment from Haiti for the crime of having won its freedom. This demand for compensation reveals the enduring power of the worldview that Du Casse and his contemporaries represented. Even decades after the Haitian Revolution, even after slavery had been abolished in the French Empire, French elites continued to believe that they were entitled to profit from slavery. They viewed the liberation of enslaved people not as a moral triumph, but as an economic loss for which they deserved recompense. This mentality, that the profits of slavery were legitimate and that disruption of those profits was an injustice, was precisely the mentality that Du Casse had embodied and advanced throughout his career. We should remember Du Casse not as an exceptional villain, but as a representative figure. He was one of many Europeans who built personal fortunes and advanced their careers through the slave trade. He was one of many colonial administrators who facilitated the expansion of plantation slavery. He was one of many men who managed to separate their personal morality from the systemic evil they participated in and profited from. His success, his wealth, his titles, his honors, his social advancement came entirely from slavery. The trajectory of his life, from merchant sailor to admiral, from Huguenot outsider to knight of prestigious orders, was made possible by the Atlantic slave trade. He is proof that the slave trade was not a marginal or disreputable activity, but was central to European economic development and social mobility in the 17th and 18th centuries. The slave trade enriched not just individual traders like Du Casse, but entire nations, particularly France, England, Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands. The wealth extracted from enslaved labor in Caribbean and American colonies funded European industrialization, financed European wars, and supported European consumption of sugar, coffee, tobacco, and other luxury goods. The grand buildings of European cities, the art collections of aristocrats, the military power of European states, all were built, in significant part, on profits from slavery. Consider the connections between Du Casse's career and the broader development of French power in the 18th century. The wealth flowing from Saint-Domingue helped finance Louis XIV's wars, which reshaped the map of Europe. The naval power that Du Casse helped build, through his own service and through the buccaneers he organized, extended French influence throughout the Caribbean and Atlantic. The commercial networks that moved enslaved people, sugar, and manufactured goods across the ocean connected France to global markets and made French merchants wealthy. Du Casse's grandson, Jean-Baptiste de la Rochefoucauld de Roy, would become a naval officer who led the Duc d'Anville expedition, a massive but ultimately disastrous French naval campaign against British North America in 1746. The wealth and connections Du Casse had built through slavery enabled his descendants to pursue military and political careers at the highest levels. The benefits of his crimes extended across generations. Jean-Baptiste du Casse died wealthy and honored. He never faced justice for his role in the slave trade. He never expressed public regret for the suffering he caused and profited from. He was buried with full honors, and his family continued to enjoy the wealth and status he had accumulated. His grandnephew would even write an admiring biography of him in 1876, titled L'Admiral du Casse, Chevalier de la Toison d'Or. But history has a longer memory than individual lives or family pride. Du Casse is remembered now not as a great admiral or a successful governor, but as one of the many men who built personal success on a foundation of human suffering. His career illustrates how ordinary ambition, operating within an unjust system, can produce extraordinary evil. It reminds us that societies can normalize terrible practices, that intelligent and capable people can participate in atrocities, and that wealth and honor can be built on cruelty. The wealth Du Casse accumulated, the titles he earned, the honors he received, all came with a price that he never paid, but that hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans paid on his behalf. When we evaluate his life, we must place those costs at the center of the calculation, not at the margins. His success was their suffering. His advancement was their bondage. His fortune was their death. And we must remember that the systems he built and benefited from did not end with his death. The slave trade continued for another century after he died. Saint-Domingue continued to import tens of thousands of enslaved Africans annually right up until the Revolution. The plantation economy he helped establish continued to generate profits for French elites. The racial hierarchies he helped enforce continued to structure Caribbean societies long after slavery was formally abolished. The legacy of men like Jean-Baptiste du Casse is not just historical, it is contemporary. The wealth disparities between Europe and the Caribbean, between white and black populations in the Americas, between the descendants of slave owners and the descendants of enslaved people. These disparities were created by the slave trade and have been maintained through centuries of economic and political structures that continue to advantage some groups at the expense of others. Understanding Du Casse's career helps us understand how these systems were built and how they continue to function.